Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to this book launch. My name is Duma Gubule. I'm your facilitator for the day. Thank you so much. This is the book. It's called Can Africa Do Economics? We've got 3 authors here, the chapters in the book. And by way of introduction, I believe Africa can't do economics. Africa, with 1.4 billion people, accounts for 17% of the world's population. We have a GDP of 2.8 billion. It is equal to 2.5% of the world total. France, with 68 million people, has a higher GDP than the whole of Africa. Our GDP as a continent would be 19 billion if our share of world output was the same as the share of the population. It should be 6.8 times larger than our current GDP. Now, if we look at the forecasts for our economy, the African economy, I just have to mention that one thing that I can't stand is this thing called sub-Saharan Africa. There is one Africa. There's one Africa, and we should guard against efforts to divide us as Africans, whether it's, and also, so if we look at the forecast for this year for Africa, GDP growth of 3.9% by the Africa Economic Outlook, Central Africa 4.4%, East Africa 5.9%, where Marion comes from, North Africa 3.6%, West Africa 4.3%, and Southern Africa 1.9%. And what is bringing Southern Africa for a very long time has been the lowest growth in the whole continent. And I was trying to talk to Marion earlier on. I think South Africans don't understand the scale of the economic crisis that we're facing in South Africa. We have 12.7 million people who are unemployed. The unemployment rate is 43.1% for people of all races. For Africans, it is 47.5%. For African females, it's 51.7%. And for young people, youth, it's 72.4%. For graduates, 1.1 million unemployed graduates. If you talk about the the skills mismatch theory, many of you are students. It is a fallacy. It's a fallacy, as Reg once told me. It is not about skills mismatch. So if I have to summarize, we as South Africans as well do not know how to do economics. So if you summarize our economy since 1994, I call it 30 wasted years. You can talk about it as like a football game, a story of 2 halves. From the first half, from 1994 to 2008, our economy grew by about 3.6% a year. Many South Africans felt that things are getting a little bit better, but we could do much better. But what has happened in the last 16 years, there's been a GDP growth collapse to 1.1% a year. And what has happened? That means that the number of unemployed people over the last 16 years has increased, the labor force has increased by about 8.7 million people, and the number of unemployed people has increased by 6 million people. We have only created 2 million jobs, and only 1.2 million those are in the formal sector. So what I'm trying to say, I think South Africans, there is so much discourse in South Africa, we are not focusing on the issues. Now, in terms of the author, the editor is Grieve. Grieve used to be at UCT. He's very familiar with South Africa. And Grieve's chapter is an incredible chapter. He explains, a lot about the macro picture of the continent. He shows that from 1990 till just before the pandemic, the international poverty line for sub-Saharan Africa, he talks about, but anyway, so he explains how poverty has become largely an African thing. The statistic is that in China, 40 years ago, the poverty was about 80%, is it? Yeah. And then into 1978, it was about 80%. They reduced poverty by 2019 to 2%. This is what you can achieve in 40 years if you have a proper government. And I've been in China on study tours a few times, and I can tell you that everything you see in China now was not there 20 years ago. And I was trying to explain to people, Uguti, we once went to this village where President Xi was a mayor when he was young, and it's the equivalent of what, a township. They just raise the place and they build new places. So Soweto or Tembisa, they would just look at it and say, no, we don't want our people to live like this. So what people don't understand is the scale of what we need to do. Marion Ouma, in her chapter, she talks about the role of cash transfers. What I found is that she talks about the African experience with cash transfers. Now, I'm part of the campaign in South Africa for a universal basic income, and I've been part of this campaign for the past 5 years. And I think the issues in South Africa are quite different from the rest of the continent because we've got about 44% of people on social assistance programs, and if you include contributory social assistance programs, about 60% of the population. That's what we have in South Africa, and she'll give her view on this. And then Reg, just as a matter of introduction, I found something very interesting in your chapter, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It was a fascinating chapter by Reg, is that we've been sold this propaganda of Milton Friedman that inflation is everywhere and a monetary phenomenon. Is that how it goes? Yeah. Now, Reg says inflation in South Africa is mostly a supply side issue. Now, basically what it means, and I've been thinking about this, for the past 25 years since we've had this inflation targeting, there's never been one situation where it's been because of too much money chasing too few goods and services. What we have in South Africa is the opposite. There's too little money chasing too many goods and services. We have excess spare capacity of more than 20% in our economy, the opposite of what happens under inflation. So what we've seen under inflation is mostly the exchange rate depreciation, food prices, droughts, externally driven, as Reg says. So I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, a doctor, and I said, give me a medical analogy about our monetary policy. Our monetary policy is the equivalent of giving someone who's got a everyday flu, which is a viral infection, giving them an antibiotic. It's useless. It's the same as giving them water to treat a few. So thank you so much. Grieve, can you start and give us the macro picture for the whole continent? I will give them about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for everybody to discuss here. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody, friends in the audience, my friends up front here. I'm incredibly honored that Duma accepted to facilitate this book launch today. I'm a very big fan of Duma's work. I've been a big fan of his work. He's such a gentle soul, but follow him on Twitter, and he can be angry when he's on Twitter, and rightfully so, right? Rightfully so, based on what he's told us. There's ways in which we can do our policy making in Africa in a way that leads to an incredible reduction in want and poverty and so on and so forth. So a big fan of Duma, and also glad to see friends in the audience. One of my almost dearest friends, Sean Mola, is here. Good to see you, Sean. All right, so Duma sort of started quite provocatively by saying, answering question raised by the book, Can Africans Do Economics? And Duma said no, and he's right. But what my chapter tries to do is that there was a time when we could do economics, right? There was a time when we could do economics. In many African countries, between 1960 and 1975, 1980, you had progress towards reductions in poverty, social transformation in society, improvements in gender relations, improvement in wages, improvement in the lot of the working class, and much of that was off the back of state-led type of developmental policies. But this knowledge we've forgotten, deliberately undermined by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and we got to a point where the predominant way of doing economics is neoliberal economics, which Duma so eloquently said is treating a virus with an antibiotic, right? You're not going to get any progress there. So also a few words about how the book came to be. Grieve Chelwa, who until recently was a publisher at Inkani Press, reached out to me 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, and she said, "Look, Grieve, you are angry about things. I can see angry about the state of the economy, much like Duma. So is there a way in which you could, gather a bunch of people around who have interesting things to say about reclaiming a type of economics that results in improving the lot of our people?" So I reached out to people who I know, dear friends of mine whose work I admire. Regin Kosi, who writes a lot about monetary policy and critiques monetary policy here in Africa, here in South Africa, but his critiques are very much relevant because, again, as a late, great Malawian economist, Tandeka Mkandawire, said, what we like to do in Africa is, he called it institutional monocropping and monotasking. So we like to copy from elsewhere and implement here without thinking about it. So the predominant way in which monetary policy is done in South Africa, if I'm not wrong, Reg, is inflation targeting, right? Is that still a thing? Okay, so most central banks in Africa do the same thing, forgetting that the central bank can actually be a very powerful tool for development. In East Asia, for example, with East Asia, what they call the East Asian miracle, we think of it as a miracle, as if it just happened, but actually there was intentionality behind it, and the central banks in the East Asian countries played a big role in transformation of society there. So some words, and I'm glad that, and then Marion as well, who's an expert on social policy, and thinking about social policy not just as the way the World Bank and IMF, and this, I don't want to talk about your work, Marion, but I find it very interesting. You will talk about it in detail, but she's sort of turning social policy on its head and saying social policy can actually be a tool for transformative development. So this was also fascinating. And then we have another colleague of ours, Ndongo Sambasila, a very well-known Senegalese economist, one of the most important voices in thinking about. So he's written an excellent book on the CFA franc. I think most of people in the audience know that we have a colonial currency in Africa. It's in West Africa. It's the CFA franc. It is controlled by the Bank of France, which is bizarre because, money is so important. I mean, how can you have meaningful independence if you have no control over your money supply and all that kind of thing? So Ndongo Sambasila also contributed an essay in this book. And essentially Ndongo's essay is asking us to live as Thomas Sankara lived, the famous Burkinabe revolutionary, and sort of challenging us to live as Thomas Sankara lived, and through that to derive, an economic policy program. And then we have another colleague, Cleopas Sambo, who also writes about essentially how the IMF and World Bank defines and thinks about poverty, and how they mobilize poverty to discipline, so poverty discourses to discipline and constrain possibilities in Africa. So some final remarks on my own chapter here. And basically my chapter is titled Development as Emancipation. And essentially what I'm trying to do in this chapter is to say development is much more than just, improving the material conditions of people. That is important, certainly, but it should also be thought of as an emancipatory project, right? And what I try to do in my chapter is I try to go back and read the speeches of the founding fathers, mostly men founding, first presidents of in the immediate post-colonial period in Africa, and try to read their speeches and try to understand how they saw the development, the necessity for development. They didn't just see it as a technocratic issue, like a thing about, we improve the lot of our people and it ends there, but they also saw it as something that would lead to the full manifestation of self-determination, which was a clarion call for independence, to determine your own lives as you see them yourselves. And development should play a central role, right? Not just technocratic, but also political project. And I'd like to quote, for example, a famous speech, I think it was 1969, that Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, gave, and it's sort of, this is a quote that I open my chapter with, and the quote reads, "Freedom and development are as completely linked together as are chickens and eggs. Without chickens, you get no eggs. Without eggs, you soon have no chickens. Similarly, without freedom, you get no development. And without development, you very soon lose your freedom." Right, and I think this is how they saw development, quite different to how our leaders today talk about development. They don't talk about it as an emancipatory political project. They usually talk about it as, we need to develop, and even if the development program or development path that we're embarking on ever entrenches us or ever subordinates us more to the global north or or to the west, they don't really mind about that. So essentially what I'm trying to do in this chapter is to reinvoke this understanding, bring back this understanding of development as a political project. We've got to understand it as a political project. We've got to understand it as the sufficient condition. Political independence is necessary, but development is sufficient for us to meaningfully attain or achieve self-determination. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do in this chapter. And as Duma said, I sort of present some very stark, depressing statistics about how in 1990, poverty was actually not entirely an African story, right? Mostly poverty was an Asian story in 1990. By that we mean the biggest share of the world's poor were in Asia, right? And then now it's a completely depressing story because global poverty is an African story. The biggest share of the world's poor reside in Africa, right? And it wasn't always like this. So there was a time when we did economics. And I think it is useful for us to reclaim that tradition, to learn from the experiments and experiences and the mistakes and the successes of that period when we could do economics, and update the strategies, the policies, the toolkits for the challenges of the 21st century. So that's essentially my remarks, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grieve. Yeah. Grieve is based in the UAE. He teaches there, and he's flying out tomorrow. It's an honor to have you here. And there's a part in the chapter where he says, I think it's from 1967 to 1980, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa. So correctly, there is a time when we're doing economics correctly. But then something changed after that when we, the neoliberal policies took over. Yeah. So Marion came this morning from Nairobi. Kenya is one of my favorite countries. I must just say that. So, but anyway, let's not go there. But I really like Kenya. But anyway, the good thing about Kenya, you can get your, like when I travel, I need to get my cappuccino with oat milk. You can get it in Kenya, so you can get your comforts that you have in South Africa in Kenya. But anyway, thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Duma, and to the audience who's come here, and also to Inkani for inviting me to come and just for the launch of this book that Grieve, graciously invited me to contribute to. And so I think my chapter is on social policy, but I think the gist of it is about policy sovereignty and policy autonomy. And I think I use social policy and cash transfers as an entry to that. And then, as Duma rightly says, maybe in South Africa, there's been a different experience with social grants. But most of Africa has had, in the last 30 years, this proliferation of cash transfers as a silver bullet. It has been sold to us as a silver bullet to all our problems. So in most cases, you'll hear cash transfers mentioned to be the medicine or the antidote to all the problems that we have in many of our countries. So it's a problem to, when you have, women economic empowerment, child poverty, sexual debut of girls. It's a problem. Basically, what I say is it's been presented and it's used as a solution looking for a problem. Yeah. So if you have a problem on the continent, whatever it is, give them cash, just give them cash, There's even a book called that, just give them cash, give them cash. And the thing is, the argument that I make and what we talk about in the chapter is that this has not been an organic, homegrown social policy instrument that has grown out of the demand by the people, but rather it has been a top-down policy instrument that then has been enforced by the British, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, UNICEF, UNIFEM, whichever the United Nations. Basically, it has been a top-down policy approach that has been forced on African governments, that you even find it in some of IMF and World Bank conditionality documents. That's how far it goes, that you have to implement cash transfers. But then there is the deficit of the policy instrument itself, of cash transfers. And what's happened is that the focus has shifted from, for instance, the post-nationalist, from the pre-independence period, where we had broad-based universal social services provision, for instance, education and health, to the single instrument of cash transfers. So now governments have been made to seem like if you're not doing cash transfers, then you're not doing any social development or any social policy. And so now the focus has shifted to this one single instrument of cash transfers. But in reality, and it's been lauded as a left idea, a socialist idea. But it is not. It's actually a neoliberal idea that then starts from, you read Milton Friedman, you go to Hayek, and it is seen as a tool. They say cash is going to be the way in which you give people the freedom. So it's actually, as much as it's sold to us as a left idea, it's actually a very neoliberal idea that if you trace, I like to do this, you do the genealogy of an ideology. You always have to know where the ideology came from. When you do this, then you see that actually its roots are in the neoliberal thinking, and neoliberal thinking. And it has drawn attention from other important social services, health, education, and now governments are focused on this that they have to implement. And I know Duma talks about UBI, and as you know, and UBI is talked as and seen as the solution to the problem that we have. But actually, it is a misdiagnosis of the problem. When you say that UBI is a solution, it's a misdiagnosis of the problem, because what has happened is people do not have jobs. Most of the time, it's argued that people do not have jobs. This is the way we are going to be able to sustain a population that doesn't have jobs. Unemployment is on the rise. And he rightly says also that it's sometimes not, it's actually a problem of underemployment. There are jobs maybe, but from the salary, the wages that you would get, they do not allow you to live do not allow you to have a decent life. They do not allow you to have human, it's about human well-being. It's about utu. We call it utu in Swahili, I think it's called Ubuntu. It's about utu, and that's the purpose of development. It's supposed to help you. You're supposed to have a decent life. And the idea of UBI, as much as it's hailed, and that's the thing. It's hailed from both sides, the left and the right, the tech moguls, Zuckerberg, and everybody says UBI is the way to go, but it's actually a way in which capital seeks to be subsidized. Because, for instance, Zuckerberg in California, where you live and you have rent and a high standard of life that you cannot afford, that they do not want to pay for, so UBI will come in and fill the gap for capital. So what is sold to us as, the idea of cash transfers, UBI, is actually a very neoliberal idea that individualizes people, it atomizes people, and it actually erodes the whole idea of collectiveness among us. But also the policy-making process of it on the rest of the continent has actually been top-down, and it's been forced on African governments to take on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. Reg, so Reg is South African, so he's going to give us mostly a South African perspective. Now, I just want to quickly, I've never understood. Someone must explain to me. Why does our government issues the currency? All the currency that you have here is issued by the government. Why do we have to go and borrow the currency that we issue from the private sector, from the banks and the non-bank financial institutions? This is your Old Mutual and your Sanlam, the asset managers, or whatever, on usurious terms. And this is the problem that we have as Reg. Me and Reg, we agree on. Why do we have to do that? I just want to quickly, so people get really scared when we talk about this. And I just want to, before Reg speaks, in 2024, the budget said the Reserve Bank would transfer 150 billion rands of a 500 billion rand surplus in the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account over 3 years. There will be transfers of 100 billion rands in the first year, 25 billion and 25 billion the following year. This is an account, an obscure account at the Reserve Bank that covers the revaluation of our foreign exchange reserves. You hear that South Africa is broke. We've got foreign exchange reserves of 1.2 trillion. That's first, yeah. So at the end of March, but the Reserve Bank didn't sell foreign exchange reserves to make these transfers to National Treasury. I spoke to the governor at the time and he explained to me the steps. Basically, they created monopoly money at the stroke of a pen. They transferred from one part of the national balance sheet to another. And so now it shifted book entries from one part of the balance sheet to another. It was the equivalent of a family when you've got a cash crunch, you don't have money, and you realize that the value of my property has gone up. So you go to the bank manager, you have a what you call it. So what I'm trying to say is that in that account, there is now 400 billion rand because the gold price has been going up. But we can always issue the money. We don't need to have money in an obscure account, Reg. The central bank can always issue the money. But Reg, some people, it makes them feel better that we haven't printed money because we access the money from this account. Secondly, during COVID, we spent 60 billion rands to pay for 13 million people who were temporarily unemployed. We didn't tax anyone. We didn't borrow a cent. What did we do? We tapped into the UIF surplus. At that time, it was more than 100 billion rand. There was a surplus there. So we spent 60 billion rands to just give people cash salaries, That's number two. And then in that kitty, there is still another 120 billion rands. And I could go on and on. Reg will explain these things better. Yeah. So me and Reg, we don't understand. And the last thing I want to say is that we are very different in South Africa to other African countries. We've got the unique privilege that is very rare amongst developing countries. The majority of our foreign debt is denominated in our local currency, the rand. 90% of our foreign debt is denominated in local currency. And that is a big difference to what we're seeing. You were speaking at UJ about the African debt crisis. We don't have that problem. Most of our debt is in South African rands. Reg, please explain this. People get scared when we talk about monetary policy. People feel that they don't understand. I don't know. Please try, my friend.
Thanks, Duma. Dumelang bakhaetso. Marion, myself, and Duma sat here, and we're talking that South Africa is in a crisis, massive crisis. So she was trying to get a sense of how much the country is in a crisis and so on. But so we're trying to give her a sense of how we are in a crisis. Yes, the crisis is essentially because we don't understand economics. Most fundamentally, we don't understand monetary theory and therefore monetary economics. But before I get into this chapter, on 17 October 2017 or thereabout, Janet Yellen, I think we know Janet Yellen, most of us, recently departed Minister of Finance in the US. She was also the governor of the Reserve Bank of the US. They call it the Fed there. She said, the Fed, the Reserve Bank of the US, does not understand inflation. So this is a teacher of economics who is married to a Nobel-winning teacher of economics. His name is Akerlof. And she goes out and says, we don't understand inflation. Now, in Pretoria, we have a governor and the Minister of Finance. They talk of inflation targeting, inflation targeting, inflation targeting. What's that? Now, when you talk to them and when they talk to us, they are the people who are on top of monetary theory and therefore monetary policy. Now, the Nobel-winning teacher of economics says, well, this is a fuzzy thing. And we've been debating, and in this book, in my essay, I highlight that the inflation targeting issue, inflation the way it is in fact dealt with in the country, is erroneous. It's flawed, completely flawed. So, I'll talk to Duma's issue again just now, but if I were to summarize what is in this chapter in a liner, one-liner, is that neoclassical theory of money or monetary theory in neoclassical sense, and therefore monetary policy is flawed. The monetary policy that we've been following here, we follow here in Pretoria, whether it's in Nairobi, in Lusaka, anywhere in the continent, is flawed. And it is for that reason that the economies are actually having lots of challenges, whether those challenges are debt, the poor growth that Pretoria is experiencing, is as a consequence of not understanding monetary theory and therefore monetary policy. Now, you may ask, well, but just how? The fiscal policy that we have here, or many, many countries have, is essentially determined through monetary theory, monetary policy. So there is, in fact, a very direct link between the theory that you practice, or the policy that you use, in monetary policy that you use, and the fiscal policy. So I argue, therefore, I walk you through the monetary theories and monetary policies for the continent from when we had independence in 1957 in Ghana to today. And I conclude, say, not only is the neoclassical theory flawed, the entire monetary policy is flawed. So I articulate there, issues relating to what sort of monetary policy we should be having. In fact, those of you who might have read some of my writing, I don't call this so-called monetary policy in here in Pretoria as monetary policy. I call it the interest rate policy. And therefore, you have the Interest Rate Policy Committee. Monetary policy, as I articulate in this essay, is far much more complex But perhaps that's, I argue with the students, PhD students and master students, to say, well, these formulas that we've been using, we were all taught. They're a complete waste of time. And unless we change, unless Africa changes, we're going to have to experience this mess that we see here in Pretoria, in Nairobi, in Lusaka, and everywhere else for years and years to come, because the theory that we use is flawed. So I give some examples. Well, I say places like East Asia, that we saw growing from, they were poorer than South Africa, all right? The only equivalent country in East Asia in the 1960s was Japan. So South Africa and Japan were almost here. So where is Japan today? It was the second largest economy until Maloba some few years ago. China, very, very poor. Very, very poor. I was a government worker in Pretoria. We could see Beijing grow almost on a daily basis. No use of any monetary interest rate policy in China. In Germany, the same thing. In the US, previously, the same thing. UK, the same stuff. But somehow, Pretoria, the Reserve Bank, Nairobi, Lusaka, and so on, they continue to insist that they understand monetary policy, when in fact they don't. Now, but where does all this come from? So I articulate in the essay that there's the economics that we learn, all of us, is based on supply and demand and so on. And therefore, the interest rate being the mechanism that equilibrates the supply and demand. Well, this thing is taught to all economists. It's fundamentally wrong. And unless we change that, but what then if it's not interest rate? I argue. So there are two aspects of this. Either you use interest rate, you understand that interest rate is the mechanism for economic growth, so that if interest rates goes down, then economies want to go up. If it shoots up, then the economies want to go down. But there's no robust evidence to that. There were zero interest rates in Europe not long ago. In 2007 up to 2008, for over 5 years or close to 10 years. In the US, almost zero. But there wasn't growth at all. So the economics we've been taught is flawed. And therefore the economics and monetary theory, therefore, because monetary theory affects the fiscal policy, monetary policy affects fiscal policy, all that stuff is, I'm afraid, a complete waste of time. That's why when the governor shouts, we just laugh. And I'm not a very good friend of the governor, Duma. I think those who have read my pieces, they say, but this guy was in government, man, he should, and so on and so on. But it's not about being government. It's about what is in the national interest. So I think I've consumed my 10 minutes. Duma was talking about the money that we create, out of nothing. It's going to be so inflationary. That's what Pretoria tells us. But yet, Nobel-winning teachers of economics, but we don't understand inflation. Pretoria, which copies virtually every single thing in monetary policy, says they understand inflation. There's this ERRP, Duma, the Economic Recovery Plan. There's quantitative easing. This quantitative easing stuff. We wrote against the nonsense that we think is economic nonsense, academic nonsense from the government and the Reserve Bank to saying that you don't know what you're talking about. So we had to challenge them from a technical perspective. They couldn't obviously respond. So I think if Africans can do economics, Grieve, this is the place where they should begin to have a sense of what this economics is supposed to be, and to have a sense of what monetary theory ought to be, and therefore monetary policy. And its link, therefore, to the fiscal challenges that Pretoria, Nairobi, and Lusaka, and Accra have. Thanks.
Thank you. So just to bring it back, let's go back to COVID, what happened during COVID. The central banks, the stimulus packages were about 17 trillion rands in COVID. Who created those stimulus packages? Most of it was created by central banks. In the US, the stimulus package was 4.9 trillion. The central bank financed half of it. They gave cash to people who are unemployed. They gave cash to businesses. They gave cash to municipalities. They gave cash to non-government organizations. And while I'm talking about that, the People's Bank of China gave cash to build hospitals to respond to the COVID crisis. In the UK, the debt, they took a debt, I think it was about 350 billion pounds. 97% of that was financed by the central bank. In the euro area during COVID, 1 trillion euros, 83% was financed by the central bank. So cash transfers reached 1.4 billion individuals, 17% of the world population. About half of the populations of East Asia and North America were covered. They got cash. I remember reading in the Financial Times at the time that the cash transfers in South Korea, they've got a very beauty conscious. People used it sometimes to do, enhancements to their faces, But so I'm just saying that every country, they gave cash, to people during, it was like an immediate, where was the inflation that followed from that? None, yeah. So I would like to open it. It's a bit bright from our side. We can't see properly. It's almost like you're in a TV studio, but I'll try and, anyone wants to let's start with you, yeah.